What adjectives could one use to describe American Motors vehicles? Strange, funky, odd-looking, cheap, and, well, interesting and fun, I would suppose. I've owned a number of AMCs over the years, and there's always something a little quirky about them. And perhaps part of it is because they simply didn't have much in the way of capital to develop new products or produce them, and often had to make do with very little. And frankly, I think they did an excellent job. American Motors effectively had one platform for a good fraction of its lifetime, and whether you got an Ambassador or a Gremlin, as an example, the motor compartment rails and the suspension setups were very similar across the vehicles. And it really was the genius of AMC that they could produce so many different vehicles on one single platform. Just great engineering overall. Now, over the course of time, as I mentioned, AMC vehicles were pretty funky. And take a look at this Matador coupe interior. It doesn't get much more funky than this. Of course, the Matador coupe would have the optional Oleg Cassini interior in some years, as well as the Barcelona interior, if you wanted to really jazz up your Matador. But there were some strange, quirky features of American Motors interiors over the years, and one of which related to their climate control setup. Let's talk a little bit more about that now. So here's a typical AMC climate control from the 70s, and this one is from a Javelin. And you'll notice some very typical features, the fan speed, of course. Here you see heater temperature, then you have the mode, whether that's AC, heat, or defrost, and then you have kind of the AC temperature down at the bottom. So a little bit of an old school setup that you don't have one slider bar for temperature. You actually have two, depending upon whether or not you're using the heater or the air conditioner. This is almost like having a factory aftermarket AC by this point in your car, where you have to operate these two things independently. And again, it's kind of a throwback to yesteryear when the heater box was separate from the air conditioning setup on cars. And that was true on AMCs. There was no way to really regulate the air conditioning temperature or the outlet temperature of the vents aside from the compressor cycling on and off. So that slider bar that you see there for AC colder, and we're going to talk about in a second the desert only, which was the most extreme position, controlled the degree to which the compressor cycled on and off. So if you wanted warmer temperatures, you would keep the slider bar to the left in this case, and the compressor would cycle on less frequently, so the air outlet temperature wasn't as cold. There was no way on AMCs with these types of controls to have the air conditioned air blow over the heater core. That just was not an option. It would be in later years, but not when you see these types of controls on your AMC. So there were some, you can imagine, advantages and drawbacks. Advantages to this system was that it was very simple. But the drawbacks were a few, and the first is that, as I mentioned, it was a bit clunky. You've got all these levers, a little bit confusing to operate for the layperson unless you were used to this type of setup, as opposed to the more simplistic single slider bar and single slider for mode activation that most other domestic auto companies were employing by this time. The other downside of controlling the AC outlet temperature simply by cycling the compressor is that you have the unintended side effect of introducing humid air into the cabin while the compressor is off because it's not dehumidifying the air. And then when the compressor cycles back on, of course, then it is dehumidifying the air again. So it's kind of like you get this humid air, then dry air, humid air, then dry air. It's not an ideal setup. But again, it was one that was employed on aftermarket air conditioning setups and early air conditioning setups for a number of years. It just wasn't something that was pretty typical by the, let's say, 1970s. This control is from, I believe, a 1971 or 72 Javelin. Now, the other interesting thing on that control is that desert-only setting. Now, what does that mean, and why would AMC call it the desert-only setting? By the way, AMC would not just call it desert-only on the Javelin controls. It didn't matter if you had an Ambassador, if you had a Gremlin or another AMC, they often had that desert-only position for the AC. And that just meant that it would lock the compressor on full time. It would not allow the compressor to disengage. And as a result, if you were operating the air conditioning in humid settings or settings where the relative humidity was somewhat high that you risked the evaporator freezing over, and then you would lose cooling if that ended up happening. Hence why it was called desert only, because if you're operating it in the desert, the relative humidity is near zero. So you don't have to worry about the evaporator freezing over because the dew point temperature is just super low. Now, for whatever reason, I've never seen another car company have a control like this where there's a desert-only setting. And even the aftermarket AC setups, they allowed you to vary the temperature of the outlet air by changing the compressor cycling frequency, but they never labeled it desert-only. So I thought this was a cool and quirky feature associated with American Motors vehicles that had air conditioning. You, of course, would not see this on a non-air-conditioned car. Now, interestingly, American Motors also kind of used an aftermarket-ish air conditioning setup in its vehicles. It was generally the Tecumseh York-style two-piston compressors that were ubiquitous on Ford vehicles for a number of years before they would change over to the GM A6-style compressor, beginning with some 1972 Lincolns. But by and large, Ford and AMC used this two-piston compressor. It was pretty effective overall. Didn't have as much cooling capacity as the GM setups, but overall it worked just fine, and it was pretty gosh darn reliable. I've had a number of these systems in quite a few of my vehicles, and I find them to really not have any more trouble and probably even less trouble than some of the systems offered in competitive makes. As a result, when you ordered AC in your AMC, you often got a very reliable system, but one that certainly wasn't glamorous. And as I said, you often had to operate a series of levers and Bowden cable type devices to get your air conditioning and heat to work in an AMC, as opposed to, let's say, more higher end systems that did a lot of that work for you or did it through vacuum actuators. As the years would go by, AMC would revise its air conditioning setup, and you can see here on this control from, I believe, a 1976 Matador, that there is no such desert only. It's a very typical style slider bar by this point. And interestingly, even though AMC reverted to the very conventional two slider bar style climate controls in many of its vehicles, it still didn't use the vacuum actuators to control the doors. Like my 82 AMC Eagle has this type of setup with air conditioning. However, there's no vacuum actuator, and the air is just coming out all of the vents all the time unless you manually block off the upper registers or the upper vents. Then all the air will come out from the heater box. So it's just kind of interesting how they went about this, and I suspect, again, it was because they were trying to control their costs and probably felt that their setup was cheap, reliable, effective, and wasn't that offensive for somebody who was driving their cars to operate. And I kind of have to agree. It's nicer to have the vacuum actuators inside your car, but I don't really mind all that much when I'm driving my AMCs. Maybe that's just because I enjoy the cars overall. So what do you think about this desert-only setting? Drop a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching this spotlight on the American Motors Climate Control Desert-Only setting.